time. So this is the same picture, but not so much of the time series. I start in 1950 birth cohort, but I can go until 1985. This is, the reversal point in the mid to late 1950s that, I showed you in the prior picture. And whatever trend, that paper was talking about 10 years ago, if anything, seems to have strengthened. I think it's just remarkable that men's college graduation rate essentially is the same for 1985 birth cohort, which is the latest one I can look at, as it was in 1970 birth cohort. At the same time, women keep on, accumulating college degrees at an increasing rate. Now, while all of this is true, I think that what I think we are still not talking enough about is that despite the fact that we have a reversal of the gap in education, which is typically taken as, well, we don't have to worry about education anymore. That is not the story. When you look at the kind of degrees that men and women pursue, in college or after college, we still have not observed convergence on that, on that front. So let me try to illustrate that with, a picture. So what is this? Well, what I'm trying to do, focusing on the college educated or more, I'm trying to map the degree, the specific degree. So a PhD in English literature or a master's in business. I'm trying to map the specific degrees that men and women in those cohorts are completing with a measure of the earnings you would expect on average were you to hold those degrees, okay? And I can do that for the 1950 birth cohort going to the 1985 birth cohort. So, and then what I do is it basically kind of compute the expected gender gap in earnings, or the expected gender gap in 80th percentile earnings or 90th percentile earnings, simply based on the educational degree that those college graduates completed. And the story there is, again, one of convergence. So again, the way to read this is that in 1950, the kind of college education that men were pursuing were, mapping into 20% higher earnings than the kind of college education women were pursuing. But what you see, over time, sorry, this is for the 90th percentile earning. So you see some convergence, but since about, the late 1960s birth cohort, some kind of flattening, and we are not at zero. So to say it in other words, yes, women are graduating from college at a higher rate than men, but they still keep on completing degrees, still keep on concentrating in the field of studies that do not translate in as high earnings in the labor market. So that's just to say that I think we've kind of given up on talking about education because that's not the story, because number of years of education have just moved that way. I think we still need to understand better the kind of education choices women make in college and why they are staying away from higher earnings occupation. It might be that many of the explanations I'm going to talk about before in the next few slides are part of it, but I think this is an area that we should keep on studying. All right, so now let me talk about this wave of work on gender differences in psychological attributes. This work I started about 15, 20 years ago. Most of it was at the time lab-based. And the idea of this work is that, women are different from men in the set of traits, attitudes towards risk, attitudes towards competitive environment, kind of confidence, overconfidence, lack of self-confidence, and these traits might be explaining why women do not make it to the top. There, I have a very, oops, I'm really bad at this. Kind of, this whole work does not spend much time on trying to understand where these differences in traits, if they do exist, come from. We could spend a whole lecture on nature versus nurture. I'm not going to do that here, but I think at a few points I'll stress the fact that nurture might be a part of the story. But let me just try to kind of make the arguments in a few pictures that that have been made by this literature. So this is from a paper by our Falk and co-authors. This is based on survey data from Germany, but you'd find the same results in the lab. And this is basically measuring the gender differences in attitudes toward risk. When you are at 0, you are very unwilling to take risk. When you're at 10, you're very willing to take risk. And what you can see there is, very saliently that women, are less willing to take risks than men. Now, why is that relevant to a conversation about, the glass ceiling? Well, it is relevant because It is also the fact that occupations that pay more are also occupations that have more earning risk, higher earnings volatility. So if women dislike risk, they may select in occupations that are lower down here. Those are also occupations where the mean earnings is going to be lower. Another important psychological trait that has been dominating this work is the possibility that women underperform in more competitive environment. So this is one picture from this very famous study by Uignisi and co-authors. So what did they do there? They put men and women in the lab, and they asked them to solve mazes, right? And then they asked them to do that under two different kind of pay structure. One where you are paid as a function of how many mazes you solve. That's like a piece rate system, which is over here. And then another pay environment here that looks more like a winner-take-all situations, where you're going to be paid, and if you solve the most mazes, you get all of the money, right? So it's a tournament-like setting versus a piece rate setting, but the task is exactly the same. And I think this experiment was done with engineering students somewhere in Israel. Now, what this picture shows is that under the piece rate environment, the number of mazes that are solved by male and female students is essentially the same. But once you put the same set of students, same task, but you put this into a winner-take-all situation, you start seeing very sharp differences in that now the male students are solving more mazes than the female students are. The follow-up work, which was done by Marianne Bertand and Lise Westerlund, kind of raised the stake by saying, not only are women, kind of underperforming in these kind of higher stress, more competitive, terminal-like settings, but if you were to ask them, kind of how do you want to get compensated for this task, a lot of women would say, I don't want to be in the tournament, I want to get the piece rate. Even more strikingly, a lot of women that are very good at the task, a lot of women that are really good at solving these mazes, and would benefit from being in the tournament setting, they would make a lot of money, still say, I don't want to enter this tournament, okay? All right. So since all of this work, there's been, attempts to try to assess, well, is this relevant outside of the lab? Is there any, kind of value in this work to explain to me kind of what, the choices that women are making and what their earnings are like? And there's a body of work that has been emerging over the last few years, really trying to take these lab results into the field. I'm going to just talk about two papers, one that focuses on education and the other one that focuses on labor market earnings. So the education paper is done in the context of secondary school in the Netherlands. They are looking at ninth graders that have to choose what kind of educational track they're going to start in 10th grade. In the Dutch system, there are 4 tracks you can choose, and they vary in how prestigious they are or how challenging they are, at least perceived to be. With this, science-oriented track here being perceived as the most challenging one, the most prestigious one, and the more humanities-oriented track here at the bottom being perceived as the least challenging and the least prestigious one. Now, what they do in this paper is that they study these 9th graders, study which tracks they choose at the end of 9th grade, but also get them to perform some of the lab experiments that I described before. So they can measure for each of these 9th graders how willing they are to enter a competitive environment, okay? And they correlate this competitive measure to study track choices. So what they find is that 40% of the boys, compared to only 70% of the girls, are choosing this most prestigious track. While in reverse, 50% of the girls, but only 8% of the boys, are choosing the least prestigious track. And all of this happened while girls have, if anything, higher GPA than boys, and they are, in these Dutch schools, as good as math as the boys are. What they claim at the end of this paper is that you can explain about 23% of the gender gap in educational track choices by accounting by the gender differences in the willingness to take risk. Another paper that is, much more directly relevant to discussion of the glass ceiling is a recent study that my colleague Luigi Zingales completed, where he used our MBA students as lab rats and measured a set of psychological attributes of these students and tried to assess how these psychological attributes relate to the labor market success. And it's obviously a relevant study pool because it is, a homogeneous set of young men and women that have all decided that they wanted to pursue a career in business, which in itself is, mostly made of very competitive and challenging environment. So what do they show? So the first one is that they observe some differences in earnings at the time you leave school. So think about the salary you get in your first job after business school. So there are differences in earnings between our male students and our female students. And they also observe that there are differences in earnings at exit from the business school program based on the choices that the students made when they were running these experiments at the school. So the students that chose the piece rate setting earn less on average when they leave business school than the students that in the experimental setting chose the tournament compensation, okay? And, it is also the case that there are slight gender differences in the likelihood of choosing the tournament versus the piece rate settings, okay? Now, putting all of this together, then they ask how much of this gender gap in earnings at the time one leaves schools can be accounted for by these differences in willingness to take risk. And the answer is some, but really not a lot. So you may want to focus on column 3 and 4, which have some other background controls. I'm really, really bad. You can see that, the differences in earnings at exit is about 10%. So female students earn about 10% less than our male students at the time they leave business school. Now, if you control for the choices male and female students make on the tournament versus piece rate task, so this matters, this explains some of the earnings people get, but this does not change much the female dummy. So it's about a 10% decline in the female dummy while you account for these gender differences in willingness to take risk. This is just one paper, Blau and Can, I think this is actually 2017, it just got published, kind of went through the exercise of trying to put together all of the work that is being done, trying to assess how much of the labor market success of men and women and differences in the labor market success can be accounted for by these differences in psychological traits. These papers look at broader things. Some of them look at risk and competition, which has been my focus. Others look at, self-esteem. Others look at the big 5. I think the main takeaway I have from this work is really in that column over there, where they basically say, okay, so once I account for these psychological traits, how much of the gender gap is going away? And if you were to average across all these studies, maybe you are at about 10%. So the way I personally kind of read all this work is that, I think maybe 5 years ago, one might have been skeptical about the traction of this work in terms of explaining real phenomena outside of the lab. I think the body of work that has emerged has certainly convinced me that those traits do matter, in the real world. But the evidence we have so far seems to suggest that, the magnitudes are just not as large as one would, hope to see for this to be, the key explanation, the key forces underlying gender differences. Okay. So now let me move to, the second line of work that, has attracted quite a lot of, researchers' attention over the last, 10 years or so, which is really going back to something, much more mundane, which is that, women demand more flexibility at work, and the kind of occupations that, provide the highest earnings are also occupations where, this flexibility is hard to get, or it's expensive if you want to have it, okay? So, and why would demand more flexibility? Well, because they remain, the dominant providers of all of the non-market work tasks, in the economy, which include childcare, but other things. So a few studies related to this. This is work that I did now 7 years ago that again uses MBA students, but not lab rats. We didn't run experiments on them. We just surveyed them. And what we document there is the differences in earnings between male and female students, but not just at the time they leave business school, which was what the Zingales study was focused on, this about 10% difference, but really over time. And the main takeaway of this work is that the gender differences in earnings, while fairly small at the time our students leave school, become extremely large, especially if you account for the very high earners, if you kind of look at the means. They become very large 10 plus years post-graduation. You have a gender gap in earnings here that is about 50%, close to 60%, and this is conditioning on women that are still working. So this is not imputing zeros to the women that are outside of the workforce. The other thing that we documented in this work is that there are differences in labor supply between our male and female students, and those differences kind of grow over time. So a few things that are kind of worth stressing. If you look at the weekly hours worked, so let me just focus on that. Let me make sure I get the right button. At the time our male and female students leave school, they each work in their first year about 60 hours a week. By the time they are 10 years out, you see that our male students still work on average 57 hours per week. The mean has gone down to 50 hours for women. You also see, importantly, that much more of our female students than male students are likely to have taken, by the time they reach 10 years in the labor market, a period of about 6 months where they were out of the workforce. The amount of time women take out of the workforce, female, with MBAs take out of the workforce, is not very large. By 10 years out, the model student, female student that's working has been out of the workforce for just 1 year, but that number is less than is about a tenth of the year for men, okay? Now, what we therefore document in this subsequent document in this paper is that these differences in labor supply that I just, highlighted for you, they do a fantastic job in explaining the difference in earnings. So what is this? This is, the first row is simply the difference, the raw means, the one that I showed you graphically, which with an earnings gap that is about 10% at exit and grows to 56% 10 years out. Then you can account for some pre-MBA characteristics, which do a little bit of the work, some differences in kind of grades and courses, course grades do a little bit of the work, but then really what really matters is accounting for this, which is, have you taken any time off since you left business school, and accounting for flexibly how many hours you work per week. Once you account for these labor supply variables, you have this 56% kind of gender gap that is now less than 10% and barely significant. Okay. Golden, and this is a picture I showed you before, kind of in sense, take this, kind of MBA study and says this is part of like a broader phenomenon, right? Why would these differences in labor supply kind of matter so much, especially as I showed you before, they're not super large? Well, because those occupations that pay a lot really reward working long hours. They really reward this kind of very inflexible environment. So how can you see this in picture? Well, this is, again, the one I showed you before. Bigger gender gaps in those occupations where average earnings are higher. And now I'm going to stress the contrast between those business occupations over there and say technology occupations where you see less of these patterns, more of a flat line, but much more of a steeper line for the business occupation. And then this picture. So what is this? Well, this is an attempt to try to proxy for each of these occupations as to how inflexible these occupations are. So what is the idea? Well, what Goldin does is that she uses a census and then essentially estimate the elasticity of earnings to hours worked in that occupation. Okay? So a higher elasticity of earnings to hours worked could be, a reasonable proxy for, how inflexible an occupation is. Obviously, it's not a perfect proxy, but it's one that can be computed over time and across all occupations with census data. And there the story is really striking because what you see is that where the gender earnings gap is higher is in those occupations where the elasticity of income to weekly hours worked is particularly large, okay? So that's a sign, again, that this lack of flexibility is really what's hurting women in those high earnings occupations. And you can see that business is, over here with higher elasticities compared to technology where the elasticities are, are much smaller. One final kind of slides from this paper is that, now you can try to kind of dig deeper and understand what is different between those occupations. What, kind of this higher elasticity of earnings to hours worked in business compared to like the technology occupations, what does it mean in terms of the day-to-days that, kind of things that people are supposed to do on these jobs. So this is something that was constructing from ONET. And, let me just ignore the last two columns, focus on the first two. And the idea here is to kind of compare, business occupations to technology and science-based occupations in terms of time pressures, amount of contacts you need with others, how important is establishing and maintaining, interpersonal relationship with clients and customers. And you can see there, I think the contrast is pretty clear, right? So the business occupations involve more time pressures, they involve more kind of relationship with others, you have to maintain those relationships over time, they involve work that is much more structured. All right. Okay, so the fact that, women are, that flexibility could be what's hurting women has also been kind of recently documented by a set of papers that simply show us that women have a higher willingness to pay for flexibility. And there's been a few studies, one of them by Alex Maas and Mandy Pillay, but another one which I'm going to focus on by Wiswal and Zafar, and they both basically use the same approach. They essentially estimate willingness to pay. So present someone with, a certain kind of job amenity, how much would you be willing to pay to get this amenity in the place where you work? So what they do here is focus on a sample that's, highly relevant for us, which is NYU undergrads, and they present them with these applicable choices for jobs with different menus of job attributes. And what they find is that women have indeed a higher willingness to pay for jobs that do provide greater work flexibility, for jobs that are more stable. On the other hand, men have a higher willingness to pay for jobs that have higher earnings growth. And they claim, based on this work, that these differences in preferences for job attributes can explain at least a quarter of the early career gender gap. So women demand and are willing to pay for that flexibility. All right, so why is inflexible work particularly difficult for women? I think the first order explanation is, is children, and a wave of recent papers, I think, are just making that point so strikingly. So I'll start first with, again, our old paper that was focused on the MBAs, where, when you look at the differences in labor supply between the genders and start comparing, not just men and women, but really start comparing men versus women with kids or women without kids, you realize that it's not a woman versus man phenomenon, it's really women with kids versus everybody else phenomenon. So you can just look at, the last two columns if you want, where we look at these weekly hours worked. So indeed, on average, the women work, about 10% shorter work week than men. Now you break down the female dummy into women that have children versus women that don't have children. You see very small differences in, the length of the work week between men and women without kids, but you see very large differences between men and women with kids, close to 25% gap. There's been a few recent papers. They look the same. They both exploit the very rich Scandinavian data to, really make very clearly the point that children are really the big part of the explanation. So I'm going to talk about the one on Sweden and the other one. They're pretty contemporaneous, these papers by Kleven and Landé, looking at the Danish data. So a few caveats of this work. This is not focused on the very top. This is a rural population. This is Scandinavia. So Scandinavia, people are nice. They have long parental leave. They have very weak gender norms. The approach that they follow is essentially to look within couples. So you can basically, with the rich administrative data, track the earnings of husbands and wife over time and see what happens to the within couple differences in earnings at the time of the birth of the first child. And those pictures are striking. So this is a picture for Sweden. And you can see that, 0 is the time of the birth of the first child. You see that the earnings of the wife and the husband are essentially kind of evolving in parallel in the 10 years that precede the birth of the first child. You see a massive drop in women's earnings at the time of the birth of the first child. And these wives, now mothers, never recover. This is the Danish data. Again, this is very much the same experimental design. You see, so they made some adjustments. This is why the male and the female are right on top of each other, but really no pre-trend. And then the clear event, which is the birth of the child, which impacts, earnings, which impacts hours worked, with never a recovery, at least 10 years out. You can see the same story in participation rates, and you can see the same story in the wage rate, which suggests that in this context, it's not just the hours adjustment. These mothers, when they, kind of re-enter the workforce, are also working in jobs where I think this is monthly wage, are different. All right. This is kind of, I think, a really striking picture that, is in the paper on Denmark, where they can essentially, given the child penalty that they estimate, they can try to decompose the gender gap in Denmark from the early 1980s to the present, and assess what fraction of that gender gap is due to children, how much of it is education related, and how much of it is the residual that we cannot explain with children and education. And what you can see, I think there are two messages from this picture. One is, if you look at Denmark today, essentially all of the gender differences in earnings in Denmark have to do with children. Because, just like in the US, education is becoming less and less of a factor. Residual inequality is disappearing. And then the other thing that is striking is that you have here 30 plus years of data, but you have, I will get it. I'm sure I will get it by the end. You have, a child-related gender penalty that has basically not changed in the last 30 years. All right. So now let me just kind of, try to take a moment and say, should this be puzzling, right? So why is it that that women, especially the ones that are the more educated ones, still pay such a disproportionate price in the labor market for the flexibility they demand because they have children? And it's true that the biology of having children has not changed, at least of yet. But there are several forces that you would say should have moved this in the direction of making it less costly for women. I mean, two in particular, which is that the amount of non-market work has been going down over time. And then the other forces is that these general attitudes, the one that prescribe that the mothers should be the one taking care of the kids, while they are still there, they are weaker than they were in the past. So just a few comments on both of these. So first, I think it is very much true, and we have lots of great studies exploiting the time use data that suggests that the amount of non-market work has been going down over time. So the kind of double shift considerations that were very important in the past, I think, are less relevant today. We have the dishwashers. We have, kind of access to a pool of low-wage workers, some of them coming from, other countries. And all of these, should make it, easy on, women, especially the more educated ones that have higher earnings potentials, to not have to spend too much time in non-market work. The only thing that I would stress here is that while, these trends are clearly occurring and the amount of non-market work is going down, there's one part of the time use data that suggests that when it comes to parenting, those trends have not been as strong. And we have a few studies, I think we actually need to spend more time on trying to understand this phenomenon, that suggests, at least in the US, the amount of time educated parents, are spending on the children is going up. And we have a few papers, now they're getting a bit old, but like Valérie Ramey and Gary Rame have a paper trying to say, well, where is this coming from? Kind of maybe it's a rat race where we're all competing to try to get our kids into the best universities and the best colleges, even though it doesn't matter, as we were told earlier in the session. And, because of that, we are spending all this time. And because this is so important to get our kids in the best schools, this is not something we want to outsource to foreigners, especially when the mom is well-educated and could be doing this much better than a third party. When it comes to gender roles and gender attitude, I think it is very clear that gender norms are weaker today than they were in the past, right? So I'll show you a picture, some numbers. There's no sense that those gender norms are the same as they were in the past, which we would expect, given the changes in the distribution of human capital between men and women. Now, on the other hand, I think that the convergence in these gender norms has been somewhat weaker when it comes to the norms related to mothers and well-being of children. The view that a child can have a good childhood with a working mom, yes, has been converging, but lots of women and men are still, somewhat reserved about this possibility. And the other thing that I would stress is that they are, while the main gender norms, like women should have access to work, kind of have converged, there are other gender norms that might have been more dormant, but now becoming more binding as women are making progress in the labor market, and I'll talk about one of this. And then finally, I think that our view as to what we should call gender norms maybe is too narrow. So when I talked about, women's willingness to take risk, women's willingness to compete, yes, this might be something that we are born with, but I would argue that a lot of these, views might also be a reflection of the way we raise our girls, telling them that, they should watch out, and we tell them that more than we tell our boys. All right, so this is data from the GSS. Nicole Fortin has a bunch of papers where she would show you these numbers. So the fact is, yes, kind of both men and women have less gender conservative attitudes today than they had in the past. Every woman, agrees that they should be able to work. Nearly every man agree that, women should be able to work. The only area where you still kind of a little further away from the 1 or the 0 you'd expect under the view that these gender norms have disappeared really have more to do with, as I said before, kind of that the idea that the working mother could hurt the child, that pre-K children would suffer if their mothers work. So 2 more things. As I said, the way and what we conceive as gender norms may be too narrow. This is a picture for some work I did a couple of years back, where we look at particular gender norms, the following particular gender norm, which is that men should be earning more than their wives. And we make the case that this gender norm was not relevant in the 1970s because there was essentially no woman whose earnings could compete with their husband's earnings. It is much more relevant in the world that we live in today, right? And so what we do in this work is show evidence that, yeah, these norms seem to be there. This is a picture of the distribution of relative earnings within couples. So women's earnings as a fraction of men plus husbands and wives' earnings. And, kind of if there was, some kind of trouble within the household with having the wife earning more than her husband, you would expect exactly that picture with some missing mass to the left of point 5. In that paper, we, established a set of other facts, that the marriage rates are lower in those marriage markets where the likelihood that, a woman would earn more than the potential husband would be. We also show evidence that women are more likely to get out of the workforce or work fewer hours if they are in a situation where the potential earnings might, be higher than those of their husbands. And we also show evidence that in those, couples where these particular gender norms has been violated, things don't look as good, in that these marriages are less happy, they're more likely to end in divorce. And there's also evidence of this kind of compensating behavior that Akerlof and Crenton would suggest should be happening, is that whenever the wife earns more than the husband, she's going to take on a greater share of the laundry, just to compensate for the other stuff she's doing outside of the home. All right, this is a study that kind of just came out, and again suggests that we should not just believe that gender norms have simply gone away. So this is a paper by Leo Bernstein and co-authors that was done on another MBA pool, not Booth this time. I think this was done with UCLA students. This is an experiment, so that was built within the curriculum of the school. So students are asked to fill in a survey at the beginning of the first year in the MBA program that kind of describe what kind of job they are looking for. And this is a high-stakes survey in that the UCLA admin is going to use that survey for job placement. Okay. And students fill in the survey, and where the experimenter arrive is that they tell the students, prior to completing the survey, they tell a random half of these students that whatever information you're going to put in this survey on the kind of jobs we're looking for, we're going to bring it to the classroom, and then we're going to discuss, your preferences with, your other classmates. And there's another condition, which is the private condition, where you fill in the surveys, it's going to be anonymized, and then we'll discuss answers, okay? And what they do in this paper is compare the answers to this, fairly high-stakes surveys about job preferences between female students that are currently married and the ones that are still single, okay? And this is the kind of picture that they find. So this is comparing, again, so single female, non-single female, single male, non-single male, they're not really relevant. So let's just look at here. And this is the response to, in the survey, what kind of compensation are you looking for? And how does that response differ, depending as to whether you're being told, we're going to discuss this in front of everybody, and your name will be attached to it, versus this is an answer you're giving me in private. And what you see here is that those single women report lower desired compensation in the public condition compared to the private condition, right? So what's going on here? Well, at the very least, these women believe that claiming that they are more ambitious, right, may not be, perceived very well in front of their classmates. One of them could be the potential husband, right? So whether it is a reflection that, kind of these guys are indeed expecting to marry someone that does not have a lot of aspirations, or whether it is a reflection that women believe that the guys that are in the room, would not like them as much if they show a lot of ambition, that's not, something that we can discriminate between in the context of this study, but it shows that, this response is there. You see it as well when you look at how many days per month are you willing to travel. Again, these single women, when you tell them that, their response will be discussed in front of their classmates, say, oh, I'm not willing to travel much. And you see it, as well when you look at kind of how ambitious are you for your career. Again, single women are going to say, oh, I'm not so ambitious, when their responses will be linked to their name. All right, so a few more things, though. So still back to puzzle. So I think it is, despite all that I said, it is true that the amount of non-market work has been going down. And it is true that all the trends, with all the caveats I gave you, suggest that, it is not as true today as it was in the past that women should be the one, in charge of all this non-market work. So what I want to, kind of highlight is potentially some countervailing forces. I'm going to talk about two things. First, I'm going to go back to these measures of inflexibility. And, I'm going to ask the question as to whether technological change has been, kind of potentially hurting the process of convergence. So is it possible that at the same time that women can now be a bit more flexible and can now, provide these longer hours at work because of the changes in the home, that the labor market has been moving in the other direction, so asking for even more hours on their time. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been going on with the marriage rate of these women that have the potential to make it to the top of the income distribution. So let me go through both of these things. First one is this. So what is this? So you remember this measure of elasticity of earnings to hours worked. So the simple thing that I did is essentially kind of compute these elasticities, but over time. Going from 1980, and here I went to 2015 because 2010 is kind of the financial crisis, and I was just a bit worried about kind of whether this mess things up. So again, so what you have here is the average across occupations, weighted by the share of women that work in these occupations, of the elasticity of earnings to hours worked. Okay, and I do this for all occupations, showing you the mean and the median, But I also do this for the higher earnings, 100 highest earnings occupations and the 50 highest earnings occupation. These are 3-digit occupations. There's about 350 of them in total. And so first, as kind of Goldin has shown, it is the fact that in the higher earnings occupations, you see overall that the elasticity of earnings to hours worked is higher. That's the fact that Claudia had documented before. I think what I think is quite surprising here, and I think might be more new, is that the measures, these elasticities, have been going up over time, right? So this is, and really just the first step, but suggests the possibility that the labor market and the structure of work and job design has moved in a direction that may have slowed down sort of some of women's progress. So at the same time as they can indeed devote more time to work, it looks like work might be asking, if they want to make it to the top of the income distribution, for even more of their hours. Okay? The other thing that I want to briefly talk about is what has been happening in terms of marriage rate and fertility, and this is just I'm not going to try to explain those facts, but I think these are important facts as well. So what I plot over here is for both 1980 and 2010, but I dropped the middle years to make the slides somewhat cleaner. I'm looking at women that are in either occupations that are below the top 100 in terms of mean earnings for men, or the top 100, the top 50, or the top 10, okay? Each of those top 100, top 50, top 10 being year specific. And what I'm computing for these women is whether they are married, whether they've never been married, and whether they have children, right? And I do this for 1980, and I do this for 2010, right? So I think what you observe from there is that if you go back to 1980, women that were in the higher earnings occupations were less likely to be married, they were more likely to have never been married, and they were much less likely to have children. If you go look at today, well, you can see now that these differences have disappeared. So the differences in likelihood of having children is gone, and the differences in marriage rate is gone. So again, why is this relevant? Because I'm trying to look for countervailing forces. And this one suggests that for reasons that are beyond me in terms of explaining, the kind of women that were in those high earnings occupations in the 1980s were less likely to have a family to deal with, and that today those women that are in those high earnings occupations have a family, are more likely to have a family. So this is very much, I think, another countervailing force, and not surprisingly, these women now are more likely to be married. Who are they married to? Well, they are married to men who also have, careers that, demand a lot of their time, right? So whatever trends I showed you before in terms of the elasticity of earnings to hours worked, you can look at that for, the husbands of those wives that are, I will get it. It's nearly done, so I will get it. All right. So look at those women. So take the top 50. So in the 1980s, women that were in the top 50 earnings occupations, the average elasticity of earnings to hours work for their husbands was 0.28. It is now 0.61, right? And another way to look at it is just look at a couple and ask who within the couple, husbands and wife, is going to be the one that's going to say, "Oh, I really cannot quit work today because I have this deadline." Well, things have really not changed. By much. All right. So, summary: I think two potential countervailing forces. Maybe job design is not moving in the right direction for women, and also a lot of the women that are in these occupations where they could be making higher earnings are more likely to be married today, and they are married to guys that also have very high demands on their time at work. All right. So now let me kind of move to the final part where I just want to talk briefly about public policy, HR policy, and what role it can play, if any, in trying to accelerate the process of convergence at the top. Now, there's a huge amount of discussions that have to do with kind of work-family amenities and how the workplace can provide more of those amenities for women. Think about longer maternity leave, think about part-time work, the ability to work from home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And while it is very much true that offering this flexibility to women may make them more likely to be in the workforce, this is not solving any of the problem we have, described before, right? Because it's a matter of job design. And in fact, if you believe everything I said before, taking on these amenities is going to, if anything, kind of increase the gender gap, not reduce the gender gap. And you also have obviously floating around here kind of statistical discrimination type arguments where an employer might be particularly discouraged from giving the top client to a woman, understanding that it's not that she's not great, she's great, but she's going to be likely to take that time off, and that's going to be costly for me, and so I'd rather put a man on the job. We don't have kind of this trade-off, this potential trade-off between how this kind of work-family amenities, affect women, labor force participation on one side, and likelihood to make it to the top, has not been documented much. There's one, short paper in the AER that Blow and Can did, where they use cross-country data and compare the US to other OECD countries, and obviously the US has been very much lagging behind in terms of providing policies that give that flexibility to women, and what they find in that paper is that indeed those OECD countries that have increased the amount of flexibility they provide at work, longer maternity leave, etc., seem to have succeeded in further increasing the rate of labor force participation for women, which is what you would expect. So other OECD countries do not seem to have the same type of plateau as the one I described for the US. But on the other hand, you have the flip side, is that it looks like women have done better in the US compared to OECD countries in creeping into these kind of more managerial, higher earnings occupations. So there might really be a trade-off there. Another policy that I wanted to talk about is the idea of trying to gender neutralize childcare, if that's really a big deal. And there we have now kind of a body of work that is emerging on this topic. I mean, in theory, I kind of very much like the appeal of this policy, if at the core it's trying to find a way to further, to accelerate the process via which, once a baby is born, it's no longer the default that it's a mom that's taking care of the kids. And these policies, which are typically called daddy months or daddy quotas, at the core are trying to do that, make the dad stick at home, so that maybe he'll stick, even when the daddy quotas is gone. So there's work now looking at Sweden, Norway, Quebec also have passed these policies. My sense, my reading of this work is that the results are fairly mixed. So on the one hand, all of these studies conclude that once you reserve a certain amount of the parental leave for the father do take up those months that are reserved to them, but they typically don't take up any more than the months that are reserved to them. The rest goes to the mom. There is some evidence from this work that these daddy quotas are effective at kind of increasing the amount of kind of childcare that the father will do even later on when the child is older. Where the research, I think, has been more disappointing so far, I think with one exception, which is the work that was done on Quebec, is that there's no clear evidence that any of this has had any kind of repercussions on these mothers' labor market success. But in theory, I think these policies kind of go at the core of some of the key issues I tried to highlight. Just one, one note of caution. You could imagine policies like that, these gender-neutralizing childcare policies, to backfire, right? And in some context, we have evidence that they are backfiring. So this is academia, which is the context that we know the best. And this is a paper that look at how women's likelihood to obtain tenure at the university is affected by the introduction of daddy months in academia. So the form it takes, at my university, I'm guessing many of you have the same, is that when a child is born, kind of the father that on the faculty can take, an extra year can put an extra year on the clock, okay? So what they do here is looking at universities that pass this, kind of paternity leave, and look at how the tenure rate of male and females is affected. And this is what they find. So this is the gender, this is basically looking at the tenure rate at your university, depending as to whether or not the university has this, kind of tenure clock stopping policy that applies to both men and women. And what you find is that what the policy does is that it increases the likelihood that the fathers on the faculty get tenure, but it 0.194 minus 0.419 reduces the likelihood that the mothers actually get tenure, right? So I think what's behind this, I think, is pretty clear. Whenever the dad takes the extra year on the clock to take care of the child, he goes home and writes papers. When the mom takes the extra year on the clock, she goes home and takes care of the kid. And I think that's a very simple way to summarize this. So these policies could very well backfire. All right. Final topic is affirmative action, and more generally kind of all of these kind of engineering diversity within firm. This is, certainly an area where there's been a lot of policy effort. So most of Europe right now have some form of board quotas where they are requiring that a certain fraction, 30-40% of women on the board of corporations be women. The logic behind these quotas, as well, mechanically maybe we're going to get obviously more women in the boardroom, but you could also imagine that these policies would kind of short-circuit the kind of past dependence that may be going on within business, where whenever we are looking for the next person to be the CEO, we only have guys in the boardroom and their only friends is the men. So by bringing more women in the boardroom, we may just basically shortcut this kind of past dependence. Other arguments have to do with, creating more role models and the value of diversity that I stated before. And theoretically, one could imagine that these quotas, benefits, would exceed the potential cost of these policies. That may have to do, say, for example, with reinforcing stereotypes. So now we're starting to get some work on the impact of these quotas. So I have one paper that, we recently revised and now have 10 years of data where we studied the Norwegian experience. Norway was the first country to pass gender quotas in 2004. So now we have 10 years of data where we can look at what have these quotas done, how have they changed the likelihood for women to, make it at the top in the corporate sector. And the story that we get there is overall pretty disappointing one. So the only good news is that the quotas worked in bringing mechanically more women inside of the boardroom. That's not so surprising. What's kind of nice is that the kind of women that are brought into the boardroom are actually quality women. They look better in terms of their qualifications than the very few women that were in the boardroom prior to the quota. So the argument that you cannot find women that qualify to serve on the board, does not hold in the Norwegian context. But so the boardroom become more equal, not just in terms of bodies, but in terms of minds. To the extent that you think that we can measure minds in Norwegian registry. What's not true, though, is that, there's no evidence that there's any spillovers of these policies beyond what's happening inside of boardrooms. So if you look at the likelihood of having women, in the top of the earnings distribution at the firms that are affected by the quota, none of this is really changing with the policy. So overall, the picture is kind of disappointing, but ultimately maybe not so surprisingly so, in that if you think about the arguments I made before, the quotas are at best a very, very indirect way to deal with the kind of issues I try to claim are the main one driving the glass ceiling. And then finally, I know I'm running out of time, I think all the time, what we have affirmative action with these quotas, I think it's true that a lot of corporations are really trying to, create more diversity. Maybe because they really believe that this diversity will be ultimately good, good for the business. So, I'm going to make some claims there because I don't have any hard data except for one study. But I think women are asked, whenever there are key committees, key decisions to be made. I think corporations are trying to get women on these committees with the idea that, by having more women on these committees, this could potentially have, positive spillovers on the other women within the organization. So not much data on this, but I believe this phenomenon is going on. This is one study that looked, again, academia, University, UMass Amherst, where, you know, they kind of basically survey female faculty and male faculty, try to understand how much service work they do, and it's, you know, very clear that women end up doing more service work, serving on more committees than men do. You may wonder why this is going on, and, you know, in a recent paper, Liz Westerlund argues that, you know, well, the reason why we see more women on these committees is that, you know, these are, the women are just going to be more likely to say yes to doing this thing, even though it's not good for their career. It might be good for the career of other women with the organization, but, you know, women are doing it because they're being asked to, and the guys basically shy away. My more charitable interpretation is that this is really a reflection of, you know, trying to help other women with the organization by, you know, creating these more gender diverse committees. And while there's certainly kind of no data that I can point out to, you know, to check the impact of these policies, the one thing I just want to note is that given everything I told you before, you know, you should expect the possibility that these, you know, HR policies could have negative effect, at least in the interim. I mean, again, why is that? As you're trying to make all of your committees more gender diverse, you are taxing a very small pool of women that are the ones that are within the organization that could serve on these committees. And to the extent the time they spend on these committees is time spent out of the real work, and to the extent that they work in occupations where the elasticity of earnings to real work is very high, that time could potentially hurt the women on their way to try to succeed on their job. All right? So let me just conclude. So the one first bullet point is to acknowledge the fact that I've not talked at all about discrimination, sexism, or any of that in the context of this lecture. I am certainly not claiming that is not part of the story. I think it's really difficult to be, you know, reading the papers and make the claim that, well, there's no discrimination, that's just not a factor, there's no sexism in many of the occupations that I'm concerned about in this work. What I certainly do believe is that we can go a long way to explain what's going on at the top of the earnings distribution without tapping into discrimination as the explanation, right? So, but I'm very comfortable, whatever residual come out of all of the explanations I've showed you before, I'm very comfortable by, you know, kind of naming that residual discrimination. I'm not claiming it does not exist, but I strongly hope that you're convinced that it's not, you know, it's not the only story. I don't think it's actually the main story. I will also say that, you know, kind of, I think many of the trends are moving in the quote-unquote right direction for women, from, you know, the education trend I started with to the trends in terms of gender norms, even though, you know, those might be a bit slower. But on the other side, you know, kind of, and again, this is probably more kind of, I think, a topic for further work because I've seen much less on that. It is also possible that the changes in the nature of work over the last 30 years have, you know, kind of gone in the opposite direction for women and are kind of still slowing them down on their way to break the glass ceiling, which gets me to, you know, the very last bullet point. Now, if this is really about technology and job design and how work is organized, then, you know, kind of, I have no idea what, you know, what the future will be. It is very clear that this thing has, you know, made, I think, our work more inflexible, and, you know, we have the ability now to work 24/7. What the next wave of technological change, think about AI, will do for the structure of work, I think that's anyone's guess. Thank you so much.
Okay, we are way behind schedule. No, that's I'm a lousy chair, but it's actually Marianne's fault for delivering such a great talk. So we were all, you know, caught up there. I think we have just 1 minute for one question if someone is willing to, or if you're not very hungry. So we thank you again, Marianne.